The shadow of the gunman. Close your eyes and picture the American West. Almost inevitably, the mind conjures a specific, sun-bleached tableau. A dusty main street at high noon, the air shimmering with heat, tumbleweeds skittering past a silent saloon. Two men stand facing one another, hands hovering over pearl-handled revolvers, waiting for the church bell to toll. This is the West of John Wayne, of Sergio Leone, of 1,000 dime novels that sold a romanticized dream to a nation hungry for heroes. It is a world of clear-cut morality, where the white hat always defeats the black hat, and justice is dispensed from the barrel of a Colt .45. It is a magnificent, intoxicating story. It is also, for the most part, a complete fabrication. To understand the true history of the American frontier, roughly spanning from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the closing of the frontier in 1890, we must first shatter the glass lens of Hollywood. The reality of the West was not a glorious epic of rugged individualism. It was a gritty, complex, and often tragic collision of corporate expansion, displaced civilizations, and a desperate struggle for survival. The Wild West was far more diverse, far more corporate, and surprisingly less violent than the myths suggest. Yet the true stories are infinitely more compelling than the fiction. Consider the gunfight. In the collective American imagination, the quick-draw duel is the defining feature of frontier life. The statistical reality, however, paints a starkly different picture. In the famous cattle towns of Kansas, places like Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita, during their peak years of trading, homicide rates were shockingly low. In purely statistical terms, a cowboy in 1870s Dodge City was less likely to be murdered than a citizen of modern-day Baltimore or St. Louis. The reason was simple: gun control. Contrary to the idea that everyone carried a six-shooter on their hip, these frontier towns were strictly regulated businesses. When a cowboy rode into town after months on the trail, the first thing the local marshal did was confiscate his weapons. The famous "check your guns at the door" signs were not suggestions, they were arguably the most enforced laws on the frontier. The true driver of the West was not the lone gunman, but the steam engine and the telegraph. It was an era defined by the collision of the Industrial Revolution with the Stone Age geography of the Great Plains. The men and women who populated this landscape were not just white Americans moving west. They were a polyglot mix of Civil War veterans suffering from what we would now call PTSD, formerly enslaved African Americans seeking true freedom, Chinese laborers blasting through granite, and European immigrants speaking a dozen different languages. The story we are about to embark upon will peel back the layers of legend. We will look past the myth of Wyatt Earp to find the complex political operator beneath. We will ignore the caricature of the bloodthirsty Indian to understand the sophisticated geopolitical strategies of the Comanche and Lakota empires. We will walk through the mud of Deadwood and the silver mines of Nevada, uncovering a saga of greed, resilience, and the forging of the American identity. The working class on horseback. If the gunfight is the central action of the Wild West myth, the cowboy is its central character. In the American consciousness, he is a knight of the plains, a stoic Anglo-Saxon male patrolling the open range, unencumbered by society's laws. Yet, if we were to transport ourselves back to a cattle drive along the Chisholm Trail in 1875, the demographic reality would be startlingly different. The iconic American cowboy was in fact a direct import of Mexican culture, and the workforce was far more diverse than Hollywood ever cared to admit. Long before the first English-speaking settlers arrived in Texas, the vaquero had mastered the art of handling cattle on the open range. The very vocabulary of the cowboy serves as a linguistic map of this heritage. The word lariat comes from lariata,
chaps is a shortening of chaparreras, and buckaroo is an anglicized corruption of vaquero. The techniques of roping, branding, and breaking horses were not invented by Americans. They were adapted from centuries of Spanish tradition. When American settlers moved into the Southwest, they simply adopted the tools and attire of the Mexican neighbors they would eventually displace. Furthermore, the whiteness of the cowboy is a fabrication of 20th century cinema. Historians estimate that on a typical trail drive, at least 1 in 4 cowboys was black, and another 12 to 15% were Mexican. For African Americans, the West offered a complicated sort of sanctuary. Following the Civil War, the collapse of the plantation economy and the rise of Jim Crow laws in the South drove thousands to seek opportunities elsewhere. While racism certainly existed on the frontier, the harsh pragmatism of the cattle drive often necessitated a level of equality not found back east. A stampeding herd of longhorns didn't care about the color of the hands holding the ropes. It only mattered if those hands were steady. Men like Nat Love and Bose Ickard became legends in their own time, yet their faces were systematically erased from the cultural posters of the West. The life of these men, black, white, and Latino, was far removed from the romanticized freedom depicted in movies. Cowboying was not a lifestyle, it was a grueling, low-paying industrial job. These men were essentially seasonal laborers on horseback. A cattle drive was a logistical operation designed to move protein from the grazing lands of Texas to the railheads in Kansas, from where the beef would be shipped to the hungry industrial cities of the East. The work was dangerous, dirty, and monotonous. Cowboys spent months in the saddle, choking on the dust of thousands of hooves, sleeping on the hard ground, and surviving on a diet of beans, salted pork, and coffee that could strip paint. They faced the constant threats of drowning during river crossings, or being crushed in stampedes, or dying from simple infections in a land without doctors. They were not wandering adventurers, they were the cog in a massive economic machine, the beef bonanza that was tying the disparate halves of the American continent.
The iron spine of empire. If the cowboy was the romantic face of the West, the railroad was its iron spine, and its construction serves as the ultimate rebuttal to the myth of rugged individualism. A popular tenet of American folklore is that the West was won by hardy families in covered wagons, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps with no help from the government. The reality, however, is that the settlement of the West was one of the largest government-subsidized corporate projects in human history. The catalyst was not individual wanderlust, but the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, signed by Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War. The federal government, desperate to secure the resource-rich West and bind the fracturing nation, opened its coffers to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. They were granted massive loans and, more importantly, land. For every mile of track laid, the rail companies were gifted 10 square miles of public land in a checkerboard pattern flanking the tracks. By the time the dust settled, the government had given away over 170 million acres to the railroads, an area larger than the state of Texas. This was not a playground for the little guy, it was the birth of the modern American corporate monopoly. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad also provides a stark look at the forgotten labor force of the frontier. While the Union Pacific built westward using Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, the Central Pacific, building eastward from California, faced a labor shortage. Their solution was to look across the Pacific. By 1867, nearly 12,000 Chinese laborers were employed on the line, making up 80 to 90% of the workforce. These men, often derisively called Celestials, performed the most dangerous engineering feats of the 19th century. They were tasked with blasting tunnels through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains. In a time before dynamite was stable, they used black powder and unstable nitroglycerin.
They worked through blizzards that buried camps in 40 feet of snow, living in tunnels dug beneath the drifts to breathe. Hundreds died from explosions, avalanches, and exhaustion, their bones often repatriated to China without fanfare. Yet, in the famous photo taken at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869, the moment the golden spike was driven to connect the continent, the Chinese workers were notoriously absent, pushed out of the frame to preserve the image of a white American triumph. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad also provides a stark look at the forgotten labor force of the frontier. While the Union Pacific built westward using Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, the Central Pacific, building eastward from California, faced a labor shortage. Their solution was to look across the Pacific. By 1867, nearly 12,000 Chinese laborers were employed on the line, making up 80 to 90% of the workforce. These men, often derisively called celestials, performed the most dangerous engineering feats of the 19th century. They were tasked with blasting tunnels through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains. In a time before dynamite was stable, they used black powder and unstable nitroglycerin. They worked through blizzards that buried camps in 40 feet of snow, living in tunnels dug beneath the drifts to breathe. Hundreds died from explosions, avalanches, and exhaustion, their bones often repatriated to China without fanfare. Yet, in the famous photo taken at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869, the moment the golden spike was driven to connect the continent, the Chinese workers were notoriously absent, pushed out of the frame to preserve the image of a white American triumph. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad fundamentally broke the Wild West. It annihilated the concept of distance. A journey that once took 6 perilous months by wagon could now be completed in a week of relative comfort. Moreover, the railroad brought the ultimate tool of civilization, the clock. Before the trains, every town kept its own local time based on the sun. This was a nightmare for train schedules. In 1883, the railroad companies unilaterally divided the continent into 4 standard time zones, a system eventually adopted by the federal government. The chaotic, timeless frontier was literally being regulated, synchronized, and incorporated. The eclipse of the bison and the war on the commissary. If the railroad was the hammer of American expansion, the destruction of the American bison was the anvil upon which the Native American way of life was shattered. To understand the Indian Wars, one must look past the battlefield skirmishes depicted in movies and focus on a cold, calculated campaign of environmental annihilation. The prevailing myth suggests that the indigenous tribes of the plains simply faded away before the inevitable march of progress. In reality, they were the targets of a specific military strategy designed to break a sophisticated civilization by destroying its economic foundation. Before the Civil War, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed the Great Plains. They were the biological marvel of the continent, a thundering ocean of fur and muscle that could stop a train for hours as a single herd crossed the tracks. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Kiowa, the bison was not merely food, it was life itself. It provided shelter, teepees, clothing, tools, and spiritual significance. The Plains tribes were not aimless wanderers, they were mobile geopolitical powers whose movements were perfectly synchronized with the migration of these massive herds. The arrival of the railroad brought a new predator to the ecosystem, the hide hunter. Armed with high-powered, long-range rifles like with Sharp's Big 50, these commercial hunters could decimate a stand of buffalo from a distance without startling the herd. This was not hunting for sport or sustenance, it was an industrial harvest. In the 1870s, the demand for buffalo leather to make belts for industrial machinery in the East created a heed boom. Hunters would kill dozens of animals in an hour, skin them, and leave the thousands of pounds of meat to rot in the sun. The U.S. Army quickly recognized the strategic value of this slaughter. Generals like William Tecumseh Sherman and Sheridan understood that the mobile cavalry of the plains was superior to the U.S. forces in open combat. To defeat them, they needed to immobilize them. General Sheridan famously urged the government to let the hunters kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo were extirpated, arguing that it was the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance. Kill the buffalo, the strategy went, and you destroy the Indian's commissary. The speed of the collapse was terrifying. In less than 2 decades, the population of bison plummeted from tens of millions to less than 1,000 wild animals. The prairies were left littered with bleaching bones, which were later collected and shipped east to be ground into fertilizer. The loss of the bison broke the spine of resistance more effectively than any cavalry charge. Starvation forced proud leaders like Sitting Bull and Quanah Parker to march their people onto reservations, not because they were defeated in battle, but because their world was literally consumed. The petticoat frontier and the first feminists. If the Wild West is remembered as a hyper-masculine landscape, a world of mustaches, muscles, and muskets, it is because the history books were largely written by men who preferred to preserve that image.
The exciting fiction of the gunfight to the domestic reality of survival. The popular image of women in the West is bifurcated into 2 one-dimensional archetypes, the saintly sunbonnet Sioux standing stoically by her husband's side, or the painted lady of the saloon, a hooker with a heart of gold. Both are reductive fantasies. In reality, the frontier was the cradle of the American women's rights movement, a place where the rigid gender roles of the Victorian East dissolved under the harsh necessities of survival. The most startling fact, often omitted from standard histories, is that the American West granted women the right to vote half a century before the rest of the country. In 1869, the territory of Wyoming passed the first women's suffrage law in the United States. This wasn't necessarily born out of high-minded idealism, but rather cold pragmatism. In the rough-and-tumble mining camps and cattle towns, men outnumbered women by drastic margins, sometimes as high as 10-to-1. To attract stable families and civilize the region, legislators used the vote as a marketing tool. It worked. By the time the 19th Amendment guaranteed universal suffrage in 1920, women in almost every Western state had already been voting for years. The West was not backward. Politically, it was the vanguard of progress. Beyond politics, the daily life of a pioneer woman was a testament to psychological iron. While the men were often away on cattle drives or hunting trips, the women were left to manage the homestead. In the treeless expanse of the Great Plains, where lumber was a luxury, families lived in sadis, homes built from bricks of cut turf. These structures were dark, damp, and prone to infestation. It was not uncommon for a woman to be cooking dinner while snakes, burrowing through the sod roof, dropped onto the table. The isolation was crushing. The prairie madness was a very real phenomenon, born of the incessant wind, the lack of trees, and the terrifying silence of the horizon. Yet this environment forged a fierce independence. Women in the West could not afford to be fainting violets. They ran businesses, managed massive ranching operations, and speculated on real estate. In cities like San Francisco and Denver, many of the most successful entrepreneurs were women who, having arrived to find a shortage of domestic services, built empires on laundry, boarding houses, and bakeries, charging exorbitant rates to men whose pockets were full of gold dust but whose bellies were empty. The West also offered a strange sort of liberation for fallen women. While the brothel is a staple of Western cinema, the reality was that the madams of the frontier were often the wealthiest and most influential women in town. In an era when a woman's financial existence was usually tied to a father or husband, these women owned property, paid taxes, and wielded considerable civic power, often acting as the primary donors for schools and police forces.
They operated in a gray area of morality, certainly, but they possessed a level of agency that their high society counterparts in Boston or New York could only dream of. The mercenary badge and the corporate eye. As we dismantle the mythology of the West, we must inevitably confront the binary moral play of the lawman and the outlaw. In the sanitized version of history, these were two distinct species, the heroic sheriff protecting the innocent and the villainous bandit preying upon them. In reality, the line between the two was not just blurred, often it did not exist at all. The badge was a temporary job, a tool for personal enrichment, or a license to settle scores in a land where the judicial system was distant and corrupt. Take the most hallowed name in Western lore, Wyatt Earp. To the American public, Earp is the stoic defender of law and order who stood tall at the OK Corral. The historical Wyatt Earp was a far more colorful and questionable character. Before he was a lawman, he was a horse thief, a buffalo hunter, a gambler, and a brothel bouncer, and likely a pimp in the Illinois red light district. When he arrived in Tombstone, he wasn't looking to clean up the town. He was looking to get rich on mining rights and gambling tables. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral was not a police action. It was arguably a street brawl between two rival factions, the Earps and the Cowboys, vying for political and economic control of the county. Earp was certainly brave, but he was no saint. He was a hard man making a living in a hard place. Furthermore, the true arm of the law in the West was not the local sheriff, but the private corporation. As the railroads and banks consolidated power, they realized that local law enforcement was too incompetent or too easily bribed to protect their assets. Enter the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Founded by a Scottish immigrant, Alan Pinkerton, this private security firm became the first national police force in the United States, predating the FBI by decades. By the 1870s, the Pinkertons had more agents and better weapons than the standing United States Army. The Pinkertons were the all-seeing eye of the frontier, the origin of the term private eye. They introduced modern criminology to the West, utilizing undercover agents, code breaking, and the rogues gallery, a centralized database of mugshots and criminal histories. They were ruthless efficiency personified. When they hunted outlaws like Butch Cassidy or the James Younger Gang, they did so not out of moral obligation, but to protect the profit margins of the Union Pacific Railroad and the express banks. The outlaws themselves were often misunderstood. Men like Jesse James were not merely bank robbers, they were Confederate guerrillas who refused to accept that the Civil War had ended. Their spree of robberies in Missouri and Minnesota was, in their minds, a continuation of the insurgency against Northern corporate interests. This is why they enjoyed such shelter and support from the local populace. To the struggling farmers being squeezed by railroad freight rates, the bank robber wasn't a villain, he was a violent form of wealth redistribution. The Wild West was in many ways an extension of the Civil War, fought not with armies, but with posses, private detectives, and guerrilla bands, all struggling for the soul of the Reconstruction.
The lottery of dust and the industrial earth-eaters. The final pillar of the Western dream is the lure of the mother lode. The image is ingrained in the national psyche, the grizzled prospector, a solitary figure with a mule and a pan, kneeling by a creek bed in California or the Yukon, sifting through the silt until, eureka, he holds a nugget the size of a hen's egg. This myth fueled the greatest mass migration in American history, the gold rush of 1849. It sold the seductive promise that in the West, a man could get rich purely on luck and elbow grease. But as with the cowboy and the gunman, the reality of mining was a story of corporate dominance and environmental cataclysm. The truth of the gold rush is that the window for the little guy to strike it rich was incredibly brief, usually lasting only the first year or two of a strike.
Once the surface gold, the placer deposits, was picked clean by the initial wave of 49ers, the game changed entirely. The real gold was locked deep inside quartz veins within the earth, accessible only through heavy machinery, dynamite, and massive capital investment. The solitary prospector vanished, replaced by the wage labor miner descending thousands of feet into the dark, hot bowels of the Comstock lode in Nevada. These men weren't independent treasure hunters. They were industrial workers facing temperatures of 120 degrees, toxic fumes, and the constant threat of cave-ins, all for a daily wage. The real winners of the gold rush were not the miners, but the merchants. It is an economic axiom of the West. When everyone is digging for gold, the genius sells shovels. Men like Levi Strauss, who sold canvas pants that could withstand the rigors of mining, and Leland Stanford, a grocer turned railroad tycoon, built dynastic fortunes not by finding gold, but by mining the miners. The cost of living in boom towns was astronomical. A single egg could cost the equivalent of $25 in today's money. Most Argonauts who rushed west sent little to no money back home. Many died penniless, their dreams dissolved in the muddy streets of San Francisco. Furthermore, the quest for gold unleashed an environmental nightmare that the West is still recovering from. The myth paints a picture of a pristine wilderness, but mining was a brutal assault on the landscape. When the pans came up empty, miners turned to hydraulic mining. They built massive aqueducts to channel water into high-pressure cannons called monitors. These water jets were blasted against hillsides, literally washing away entire mountains to process the sediment. The result was devastated geography. In California, millions of tons of debris clogged rivers, caused massive floods that buried farmlands in the Central Valley and altered the hydrology of the state forever. The mercury used to separate gold from ore poisoned the water tables, leaving a toxic legacy that remains in the ecosystem today. The romantic ghost towns that tourists visit today, places like Bodie, California, are effectively the gravestones of this extract and abandon philosophy. They stand as monuments to a boom-bust cycle that treated both the land and the people as disposable resources to be used up and discarded in the pursuit of the next big strike.
The Ghost Dance and the Eternal Sunset. The story of the frontier does not end with a handshake or a treaty, but with a tragic silence in the snow. In the winter of 1890, a spiritual movement known as the Ghost Dance swept through the desperate reservations of the plains. It was a prophecy of peace and restoration, promising that if the people danced and prayed, the white man would vanish, the buffalo would return, and the ancestors would rise from the earth. To the U.S. government, however, this desperate prayer looked like an uprising. On December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, the U.S. 7th Cavalry attempted to disarm a band of Lakota. A shot was fired, by whom no one knows, and the soldiers opened fire with Hotchkiss cannons. Within minutes, roughly 300 men, women, and children lay dead. Wounded Knee was the tombstone of the Wild West. It marked the definitive end of armed resistance and the final foreclosure of the continent. The physical frontier was closed, its wildness tamed by barbed wire, railroad tracks, and the reservations. But as the smoke cleared over the frozen creek, the imaginary West began its ascent to immortality. Just over a decade after Wounded Knee, in 1903, a filmmaker named Edwin S. Porter released The Great Train Robbery. It was the first narrative motion picture in American history, and fittingly, it was a Western. From that moment on, the West ceased to be history and became the primary mythology of the United States. Hollywood took the raw, bloody, complex clay of the frontier and sculpted it into a statue of American exceptionalism.
They erased the Chinese laborers who built the tunnels. They whitewashed the black cowboys who drove the herds. They silenced the suffragettes who built the towns. And they reduced the complex civilizations of the indigenous peoples to one-dimensional villains. Debunking these myths does not diminish the American West, it enriches it. The true story is not a simple fable of good guys versus bad guys. It is a grand, messy, human mosaic. It is a story of incredible technological achievement and devastating environmental cost. It is a story of the most profound freedom and the most brutal oppression existing side by side. The real West was a place where a former slave could become a cattle king, where a teenage girl could save a family farm from ruin, and where immigrants from every continent converged to blast a future out of the rock. These true stories are far more gritty and less romantic than the movies, but they possess a dignity that fiction cannot match. They remind us that the United States was not carved out by superheroes, but by flawed, struggling, resilient human beings. The Kid and the Corporate War. If there is one figure who embodies the juvenile delinquent archetype of the Wild West, it is Henry McCarty, better known as William H. Bonney, or simply Billy the Kid. The myth paints him as a homicidal sociopath, a giggling psychopath who killed 21 men, one for each year of his life, before being gunned down by the heroic Sheriff Pat Garrett. The legend tells us he killed for fun. The history, however, tells us he killed for a paycheck and later for survival in a war that was less about cattle and more about retail monopolies. To understand Billy the Kid, you must understand the Lincoln County War of 1878. This was not a feud between rival gangs in the traditional sense. It was a commercial battle for the economic soul of New Mexico territory. On one side was the House, L.G. Murphy and J.J. Dolan, a powerful mercantile monopoly that controlled all commerce in the county. They were the establishment, corrupt to the bone, with the local law enforcement and judges in their pockets. They gouged farmers on prices and squeezed the locals dry. On the other side was John Tunstall, a wealthy, sophisticated Englishman who arrived in Lincoln hoping to break the House's monopoly. Tunstall was not a gunman, he was a capitalist. He hired young men not just as ranch hands, but as a private security force to protect his investment. One of those employees was the young, charismatic, and literate Henry McCarty. Far from the slavering madman of film, historical accounts describe the Kid as polite, fluent in Spanish, and well-liked by the local Hispanic population, whom he treated with a respect that most white Texans of the era did not. He was not a lone wolf, he was a loyal soldier. When the House's corrupt sheriff organized a posse and murdered Tunstall in cold blood, Billy didn't go on a random rampage. He was deputized by a chaotic legal system to hunt down the murderers. The regulators, as Billy's group was called, viewed themselves as a legal posse fighting a corrupt government. The violence that followed was brutal, culminating in the Battle of Lincoln, a 5-day siege that turned the town into a war zone. The U.S. Army eventually intervened, effectively siding with the House. The law won, but in this case, the law was the villain. Billy was branded an outlaw not because he was evil, but because his side lost the war. The myth of the 21 murders was largely a fabrication created by Pat Garrett himself. After ambushing and killing Billy in the dark, a move that many contemporaries considered cowardly, not heroic, Garrett needed to justify shooting a 21-year-old in a darkened room without warning. By painting Billy as a demonic superkiller, Garrett transformed his own dubious actions into the slaying of a monster. The reality is that Billy likely killed 4 men personally and participated in 5 others during chaotic shootouts. A violent record, certainly, but hardly the statistic of the West's greatest serial killer. The Prince of Pistols and the Prairie Queen. If Billy the Kid was the misunderstood insurgent of the frontier, James Butler Wild Bill Hickok was its first tragic celebrity. By the time Hickok arrived in the illegal gold camp of Deadwood, Dakota Territory in 1776, he was a walking ghost of his own legend. The dime novels had already painted him as a superhuman marksman who had single-handedly killed hundreds of men. The reality was a far sadder portrait of a man trapped by his own reputation.
The Hickok who rode into Deadwood was not the eagle-eyed scout of folklore. He was 39 years old, suffering from glaucoma, possibly a result of syphilis, and rapidly going blind. The tinted goggles he famously wore were not a fashion statement. They were a medical necessity to protect his sensitive eyes from the prairie glare. He wasn't in Deadwood to enforce the law. He had been fired from his marshal jobs in Kansas for spending too much time gambling and not enough time policing. He had come to the Black Hills for the same reason everyone else did: gold. But unable to see well enough to prospect, he made his living at the poker table, a target for every drunk who wanted to say they bested the Prince of Pistols. Enter Martha Jane Cannery, immortalized as Calamity Jane. Pop culture remembers her as a buckskin-clad Valkyrie, a sharp-shooting scout who was Hickok's equal and lover. The 1953 musical Calamity Jane depicts her as a sunny, singing tomboy. The real Martha Jane was a figure of profound grit and tragedy. She was an alcoholic, a drifter, and occasionally a sex worker, who wore men's clothing not for style, but for the practical freedom it afforded in a violent world. The great romance between Wild Bill and Calamity Jane is perhaps the West's most durable fabrication. In reality, Hickok had very little patience for her. He was a fastidious dresser who bathed daily. Jane was rough-edged and notorious for her lack of hygiene. The romance was entirely invented by Jane herself years after Hickok's death, sold to reporters for drink money. Yet, despite her rough exterior, Jane possessed a heroism that Hickok lacked in his final days. When a smallpox epidemic ravaged Deadwood, it was not the gunman who saved the town. It was Calamity Jane who stayed behind while others fled, nursing the dying miners with a tenderness that belied her hard reputation. The end of the Hickok legend is the ultimate anticlimax. On August 2, 1876, in Nuttall and Mann's saloon, he violated his own cardinal rule. He sat with his back to the door. Jack McCall, a drifter who had lost money to Hickok the day before, walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok held a pair of black aces and a pair of eights, the dead man's hand. He didn't go out in a blaze of glory. He was executed while looking at a playing card. The final irony lies in the cemetery of Deadwood. The local businessmen, sensing a tourist opportunity even in 1876, decided to bury Calamity Jane next to Wild Bill upon her death decades later. They reasoned that the two legends should be together for eternity. It was a final, dark joke. Wild Bill was forced to spend the afterlife next to the woman he had actively avoided while he was alive.
The real Lone Ranger. If you grew up in the 20th century, you know the icon, a masked white man on a white stallion galloping across the plains to the William Tell Overture, accompanied by his faithful Native American companion, Tonto. The Lone Ranger is one of the most enduring figures in American pop culture. But like so much of the West, this fiction is likely a whitewashed shadow of a far more interesting reality. Historians increasingly believe that the inspiration for the Lone Ranger was not a white man at all, but a formerly enslaved African American named Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves is arguably the most successful lawman in the history of the American frontier, yet until recently his name was absent from school textbooks. Born into slavery in Arkansas, Reeves escaped during the Civil War, fleeing into the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma.
There, he lived among the Creek and Seminole nations, learning their languages, tracking skills, and geography. He became a man of two worlds, comfortable in both the structure of Anglo law and the cultural landscape of the native tribes. In 1875, Judge Isaac Parker, the infamous hanging judge of Fort Smith, Arkansas, was tasked with bringing order to the chaotic Indian Territory. It was the most dangerous beat in the country, a 75,000 square mile sanctuary for every murderer, thief, and whiskey runner escaping the law. Parker needed deputies who could survive the terrain and speak the languages. He hired Bass Reeves, making him the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi. The statistics of Reeves' career make Wyatt Earp look like a crossing guard. Over a 32-year career, Reeves arrested more than 3,000 felons. He engaged in numerous shootouts, killing 14 men in self-defense. Remarkably, despite having his hat shot off and his belt cut by bullets, Reeves was never wounded. He was an immovable force of justice. But Reeves wasn't just a gunman, he was a detective. Unlike the movie sheriffs who walked down Main Street at high noon, Reeves operated as a master of disguise. He would dress as a tramp, a cowboy, or a farmer, walking miles to trick fugitives into revealing themselves. He was known for handing out silver dollars, a trait echoed in the Lone Ranger's silver bullets. He rode a white horse, and because he was illiterate, he often memorized his warrants, relying on others to read them to him. Yet he never arrested the wrong man. The parallels to the Lone Ranger are striking. Both rode white horses, both had Native American companions. Reeves often rode with Native scouts. Both were master trackers, and both had a strict moral code. The key difference was the mask. In the TV show, the mask hid the hero's identity. In reality, Reeves didn't need a mask. His skin color made him an outsider in the white world he served. Why was he erased? As the 20th century dawned and the Jim Crow laws tightened their grip on the South and the emerging state of Oklahoma, the image of a black man with a badge and a gun arresting white men became politically unacceptable. The legend was stripped of its race, repackaged for white audiences, and Bass Reeves was relegated to the footnotes, while the fiction he likely inspired became a national hero. The 18-month legend. If you ask the average American to name the institutions that defined the Old West, the Pony Express will almost certainly make the top 3. The image is indelible, a lone, daring rider galloping across the perilous expanse of the continent, outrunning storms and arrows to deliver the mail. It is a symbol of American ingenuity and speed. Yet in the grand timeline of the frontier, the Pony Express was not an era. It was a blink of an eye. It is perhaps the most famous business failure in American history, a venture that went bankrupt almost as quickly as its horses ran. The Pony Express officially operated from April 1860 to October 1861, a mere 18 months. It was not a government project, but a desperate private gamble by the freighting firm Russell, Majors, and Waddell. They hoped that by proving they could move mail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California in 10 days, cutting the stagecoach time in half, they would win a lucrative $1 million government mail contract. They never got the contract, and the operation hemorrhaged money from day one. It cost roughly $16 to deliver a letter that they charged $5 for, which was still an astronomical sum, equivalent to about $150 today. The logistics were a nightmare. The company had to maintain nearly 200 relief stations across 2,000 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The riders, immortalized as rugged men, were actually more like modern jockeys. The company preferred teenagers who weighed less than 125 pounds to spare the horses. The famous recruitment poster, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred," is likely apocryphal, but it captures the spirit of the job. These boys rode at breakneck speeds, switching horses every 10 to 15 miles and passing the mochila, a specialized leather mail cover, to a fresh rider every 75 to 100 miles. The irony of the Pony Express was that it was obsolete before the first horse ever left the stable. While the riders were sweating across the Great Basin, a different crew was slowly stringing wire across the same landscape. The construction of the transcontinental telegraph was the true marvel of communication. On October 24, 1861, the telegraph line was completed, connecting east and west instantly with Morse code. 2 days later, the Pony Express announced its closure. The romantic galloping horse simply could not compete with the speed of lightning. Why then do we remember a failed business that lasted less than 2 years with such reverence? Once again, the answer lies with Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody claimed to have been a Pony Express rider in his youth, a claim historians fiercely debate, as he would have been 14 years old and likely too young even for them. Regardless of the truth, Cody made the Pony Express ride a central feature of his Wild West show. Every night, in arenas from London to Chicago, audiences watched a rider gallop in circles, cementing a short-lived stopgap measure as an eternal symbol of the frontier spirit.
The architects of their own demise. If the saga of the Wild West has a grand finale, it belongs to the Wild Bunch. Immortalized by Paul Newman and Robert Redford in the film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, this gang represents the twilight of the outlaw era. In the movies, they are charming anti-heroes, riding bicycles and cracking jokes. In history, they were the most successful criminal organization of the frontier. But their downfall was not caused by a lack of skill with a gun. It was caused by vanity and the relentless march of forensic technology. Robert Leroy Parker, Butch Cassidy, and Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, operated at the turn of the century, a time when the Wild West was rapidly becoming the civilized West. They used a hideout in Wyoming called the Hole in the Wall, a geological fortress that was virtually impenetrable to lawmen. From there, they launched sophisticated raids on Union Pacific trains. They were professional, planning robberies like military operations, stashing fresh horses miles apart to outrun pursuers. They were the best at what they did. However, in 1900, they made a fatal error that serves as a testament to the changing times. Flush with cash from a robbery, the core members of the gang, the Fort Worth Five, decided to visit Fort Worth, Texas to buy new clothes. Dressed in bowler hats and tailored suits, looking like prosperous bankers, they decided to have a formal portrait taken at a studio. It was a moment of supreme arrogance. They loved the photo so much that they ordered copies. Unfortunately for them, a detective recognized one of the faces. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency got a hold of the photo and mass-produced it. They created wanted posters that were not crude sketches, but high-resolution photographs. Suddenly, the anonymous bandits had faces. The Wild Bunch could no longer blend into a crowd. The Union Pacific Railroad, tired of losing money, didn't just send a sheriff after them, they weaponized the railroad itself. They commissioned a special train, the Super Posse, outfitted with the fastest locomotive available, horse cars for fresh mounts, and a crew of expert trackers and sharpshooters armed with modern high-powered rifles. This train could stay on the tracks, mirroring the outlaws' movements, cutting off their escape routes with terrifying speed. Realizing that the American frontier was now fenced in by telephone wires and train tracks, Butch and Sundance did the only thing left to do. They left the country. They fled to Argentina, hoping to find a place where the 20th century hadn't arrived yet,
a place that was still wild. The fact that America's most famous outlaws had to travel to South America to continue their lifestyle is the ultimate proof that the American Wild West was dead long before the bullets allegedly flew in Bolivia. They were men out of time, squeezed out of existence not by a better gunman, but by the camera and the steam engine. The Devil's Rope and the Frozen End of the Bonanza. If you were to ask a historian to identify the single invention that conquered the West, they would not point to the Winchester rifle, the Colt revolver, or even the steam locomotive. They would point to a simple, vicious strand of twisted metal, barbed wire. The indigenous tribes called it the Devil's Rope, and for good reason. While the gun killed men, the wire killed a way of life. It was the physical manifestation of the end of freedom. To understand the impact of barbed wire, one must understand the geography of the Great Plains. It was a sea of grass with almost no trees. In the east, if you wanted to mark your land, you built a stone wall or a wooden fence. In the west, that was impossible. The lack of fencing material meant the range was open. Cattle from different owners mixed freely, grazing on public land, and were only separated during the roundup. This was the economic basis of the Cattle King era, free grass and free movement. Then, in 1874, an Illinois farmer named Joseph Glidden patented a practical machine for manufacturing barbed wire. It was marketed as lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, cheaper than dust. It changed the landscape overnight. Suddenly, a settler could buy a few spools of wire and fence off water sources, grazing land, and trails that had been used for centuries. The arrival of the wire triggered a forgotten civil war in Texas known as the Fence-Cutting Wars of 1883. As wealthy syndicates, often funded by British investors, began fencing off millions of acres of public land to create mega ranches, they cut off small farmers and other ranchers from water. In retaliation, bands of nipper gangs, cowboys armed with wire cutters, rode out at night, snipping thousands of miles of wire. It was a violent class struggle between the corporate monopolists and the small homesteaders. The violence became so widespread that the Texas legislature had to make fence cutting a felony punishable by prison time. However, the true horror of the wire was revealed in the winter of 1886-1887. This event is known in Western history as the Big Die-Up. That winter was one of the harshest on record, with blizzards dropping temperatures to 50 degrees below zero. In the old days of the open range, cattle would instinctively drift south for hundreds of miles, walking away from the storm to find warmth and grass. But in 1886, the drifting herds hit the fences. Unable to break through the Devil's Rope, the cattle piled up against the wire barriers by the tens of thousands. They froze to death standing up or suffocated in the crushing mass of bodies. When the spring thaw finally came, cowboys reported a landscape that looked like a charnel house. You could reportedly walk for miles, stepping only on the carcasses of dead cattle. Some ranchers lost 90% of their herds. The beef bonanza was broken. The era of the open range was dead, killed not by a lawman, but by a cheap piece of industrial hardware. The cowboy was no longer a knight of the plains. He was now a fence mender, an employee working within the rigid, rusted lines of a corporate map.
The starting gun and the death of the open map. If the closing of the frontier was a slow death by barbed wire and railroad tracks, its final gasp was a literal sprint. In the American imagination, the settlement of the West is viewed as a slow, steady tide of wagons moving toward the sunset. But one of the most defining events of the era was not a journey, but a race, a chaotic, desperate, and often cheating explosion of humanity known as the Oklahoma Land Rush. By the late 1880s, the free land that had fueled the American dream was effectively gone.
The only significant tract of arable land left was the so-called unassigned lands in the center of modern-day Oklahoma. There was just one problem. This land was part of Indian Territory, a region the federal government had solemnly promised to the 5 civilized tribes as long as the grass grows and the water runs. But the pressure from land-hungry white settlers, dubbed boomers, was politically insurmountable. The government caved, broke its treaties again, and announced that 2 million acres would be open to settlement on precisely April 22, 1889 at 12 noon. The scene that unfolded was arguably the most bizarre spectacle in Western history. On the morning of the 22nd, roughly 50,000 people lined up on the border. They were a motley collection of the desperate and the dreamy, families in covered wagons, cowboys on fast quarter horses, men on high-wheeled bicycles, and even pedestrians ready to run for miles. They stood wheel to wheel, facing a prairie that was silent and empty. At noon, the cavalry sounded the bugles and fired cannons. The earth literally shook. 50,000 people surged forward at once in a stampede of greed and hope. It was a chaotic free-for-all. Wagons crashed into each other, horses collapsed from exhaustion, and fights broke out over tent pegs. The result was the instant creation of civilization. In the morning, Guthrie and Oklahoma City were patches of grass. By nightfall, they were tent cities with populations of 10,000 people. By the next morning, they had elected mayors, formed police forces, and lawyers were already setting up desks on the street corners to argue over property lines. It was a time-lapse compression of American history. The evolution from wilderness to metropolis occurred in less than 24 hours. However, the land rush also birthed a term that remains in the American lexicon today, the Sooner. The rule stated that anyone who entered the territory before noon would be disqualified, but the frontier spirit was often less about fair play and more about getting away with it. Hundreds of men slipped past the Army patrols under the cover of darkness the night before, hiding in bushes or ravines. When the honest settlers arrived on their exhausted horses, they found the best plots of land already claimed by men whose horses were curiously well rested and whose campfires were already burning. These cheaters were known as Sooners. The fact that the Sooner state eventually adopted this nickname as a point of pride is a perfect metaphor for the West itself. It acknowledges that the foundation of the frontier was often built not just on hard work, but on cutting corners, breaking rules, and seizing opportunities before anyone else, fairly or otherwise, could get there.
The irony of the ending is bitter. The wealthy barons and their hired killers were trapped, facing certain death at the hands of the angry townspeople. They frantically telegraphed the governor, who was on their side, and President Benjamin Harrison. In a stunning misuse of federal power, the president ordered the U.S. cavalry to ride to the rescue, not to save the town from the killers, but to save the killers from the town. The invaders were taken into protective custody and eventually released without consequence. The lesson was clear. In the Wild West, you could get away with murder, provided you had enough money to hire the president's cavalry as your getaway driver. The Highway of Graves and the Feast of Despair. If the Western migration is often romanticized as a heroic pilgrimage, the Oregon Trail was its Via Dolorosa. For generations of American schoolchildren, the trail is remembered through the lens of a popular computer game where the biggest annoyance was a broken wagon axle. The reality, however, was a 2,170-mile corridor of death. Historians estimate that at least 20,000 people died along the trail between 1840 and 1869. That averages out to 10 graves for every single mile. It was not a road. It was the longest cemetery in the nation. The primary killer was not the indigenous population. Despite the movies showing circles of wagons fighting off attacks, Native Americans were far more likely to help the immigrants than hurt them, often trading food and guiding them across rivers. The true enemy was biology. Cholera, a terrifying bacterial disease spread through contaminated water, stalked the wagon trains. It could kill a healthy adult in hours. A traveler could eat breakfast feeling fine and be buried in a shallow grave by dinner. The trail was literally lined with the detritus of these tragedies: abandoned grand pianos, heavy oak furniture, and family heirlooms dumped by the side of the road to lighten the load for dying oxen. The darkest chapter of this migration is, of course, the Donner Party of 1846. While it's remembered today for the sensational detail of cannibalism, the true story is a cautionary tale about fake news and the dangers of taking shortcuts. The 87 members of the party were not doomed by bad luck alone. They were doomed by a guidebook written by a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings had published The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, promoting a new route, the Hastings Cutoff, that he claimed shaved 300 miles off the journey. The problem? Hastings had never actually traveled the full route himself before writing the book. Trusting this untested advice, the Donner Party left the established trail. The shortcut was a nightmare of rugged terrain and salt flats that cost them precious weeks. When they finally reached the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, winter arrived early. A massive blizzard trapped them near what is now Truckee Lake. The snowdrifts eventually reached 20 feet high. What followed during that winter of 1846 to 1847 is the most gruesome survival story in American history. As provisions ran out, the pioneers boiled the ox hides used for their roofs to make a glue-like jelly. They ate their dogs. Eventually, as members of the party died from starvation and hypothermia, the survivors were faced with an impossible choice. To survive, they had to consume the bodies of the dead. It is a testament to the sheer will to live that roughly half of the party managed to survive until rescue parties arrived in the spring. The rescuers found a scene from hell: scattered bones, half-eaten remains, and survivors who were physically and mentally shattered. The media sensation that followed turned the survivors into pariahs and curiosities, but it missed the point. The Donner Party was not a story of savagery. It was a story of betrayal by a promoter who sold a fantasy map, leading families into a white abyss. The twilight of the frontier and the eternal horizon. By the turn of the 20th century, the physical reality of the Wild West had largely evaporated, replaced by the humming efficiency of the industrial age. The silence of the Great Plains, once broken only by the howl of the wolf and the thunder of the bison, was now punctuated by the chugging of the Model T Ford and the ringing of telephone bells. The open range was crisscrossed by asphalt highways and partitioned by millions of miles of barbed wire. The great cattle drives were no longer necessary. Trains brought the cows to the slaughterhouses of Chicago. The frontier had not just been closed, it had been paved, fenced, and incorporated. Yet a strange phenomenon occurred as the dust settled. The dead West became infinitely more powerful than the living one. As Americans moved into crowded cities and worked in stifling factories, they developed a ferocious hunger for the freedom they imagined their ancestors possessed. The Wild West ceased to be a place on a map and transformed into a landscape of the mind. It became the American Camelot, a mythical realm of clear moral choices, wide open spaces, and rugged independence. This transformation was solidified by the rise of Hollywood. The industry, ironically based in the very state that marked the end of the trail, California, began to mass-produce the mythology. They took the complex, gritty, multicultural history we've explored, the black marshals, the Chinese engineers, the female entrepreneurs, the corporate wars, and flattened it into a simple black and white morality play. They gave us the singing cowboy and the noble sheriff, wiping away the sweat, the dysentery, and the moral ambiguity of the real struggle. However, confronting the truth of the West does not diminish its power, it deepens it. The real story of the American frontier is not a fairy tale of superheroes. It is a tragedy and a triumph woven together. It is the story of a violent collision between civilizations, a brutal assault on the environment, and a ruthless scramble for resources. But it is also a story of unparalleled resilience. It is the story of formerly enslaved people building new lives in Kansas, of immigrants blasting tunnels through solid granite to connect a continent, and of native nations fighting with desperate courage to preserve their way of life against impossible odds. The legacy of the Wild West remains the bedrock of the American identity. It is the source of the nation's restless spirit, its skepticism of authority, and its persistent belief that a person can pack up, move west, and reinvent themselves. The frontier may be closed in the census books, but the psychological frontier, the drive to push boundaries and seek the horizon, remains open. When we look back at the West today, we should not look for the John Wayne fantasy. We should look for the real faces in the faded daguerreotypes, the tired dirt farmers, the dusty vaqueros, the defiant warriors, and the hopeful miners. They are the true architects of the nation. The sun has set on their era, but the long, complex shadow they cast stretches all the way to the present day. The Wild West was never truly won, but in surviving it, a modern nation was forged.